Morning again.
Morning.
People often wish that we felt no pain. That kind of like some Marvel superhero that no matter what the world threw at us, we would feel nothing. And there are times, this morning my leg was flaring up and I was thinking it'd be nice not to have any pain. But the reality is, pain is actually an important part of our lives. Without it, we would run into great difficulty. The reason why leprosy was so deadly, especially back in the early ages, is that leprosy reduced the ability to feel anything in the hand or limb that it was in contact with. And one of the great dangers then was that you would get a cut and it could be infected and you would not notice it. And so people with leprosy always had to make sure that they would do a full check of their whole body to make sure that they hadn't taken an injury anywhere, because they don't feel it. And if you're reaching for something sharp and it starts to cut, you know to pull back. But if you have leprosy, you just keep reaching and it cuts deeper. It's like putting your hand on a hot stove, they would not feel it. And so we are reminded that pain is actually important for us. It tells us that, yes, that stove is hot, remove your hand. And then it reminds us next time that, maybe we should check to see before we touch it with our hands. Pain has that way of trying to keep our body safe and whole. But what about emotional pain? What about that pain that we carry within ourselves that just twists and turns? And there are some times where it pulls people so far down that they have a hard time ever coming up. Why do we have that pain? Sure, we need the pain for the body, but why the pain for our emotions, mentally, emotionally, spiritually? We live a couple of houses from the fire department in Petitcodiac, so we hear the sirens going off fairly regularly. And I can already tell if I'm at home, if I see pickup trucks suddenly whipping down the road, I know that in a short time there's going to be the siren going off because they've been notified. And you get used to it. It seems strange, but because it happens all the time, I'll hear the siren sometimes 2 or 3 times in a day. And I usually try to remember to say a prayer, a quiet prayer, both for those who go to fight and those for who they are called, an accident, a fire, whatever. And I hear the sound and I'll kind of just, my mind will switch to, I hope everyone is okay, and I'll say a little prayer. But on Wednesday, I was making supper and kind of in my own happy little world, I was getting this and that done, and suddenly the sirens go off. And for a split second, I was going to say, I hope everyone, and then it hit me. Kaylin and Ian were driving home down the Elgin Road from working at Fundy Park. And Pam still was not home, and she would be coming, well, later on I found out she hadn't even left work yet, but that's beside the point. But I thought both Pam and Kaylin and Ian were still on the road. And I didn't know where the fire trucks were going. And I know that they respond to automobile accidents as well. And so suddenly, the siren was incredibly different. Now, instead of just being the, I hope someone's okay, there was the sense of, did something happen to Kaylin and Ian? Is Pam okay? And the whole time then, as I was in the kitchen making supper, from my happy little world, I was now filled with some sense of anxiety and dread. And of course, the way the mind loves to do, it runs to all the worst places and says, think about this and think about this. And my whole sort of joyful little supper making experience went out the window, literally, until they pulled up. And I thought, I was annoyed. Why did I lose that 10 minutes of worrying until Pam called and Kaylin and Ian came home? Why did I lose that 10 minutes of just kind of bliss that I was in? And then I thought, well, I didn't really lose it. What I was reminded of is what I have. And that when they came home, I realized I was a lot more grateful and joyful when they came home, because I realized how precious my family is to me. I do not like to worry, but I do think that having some sense of emotional pain has its purpose, like physical pain does. Because emotional pain, it usually comes when something has changed or when something is lost. And we feel that loss. And our emotions, our thoughts go to that loss, that hole that has been created. But if we never ever go there, if we never ever think about those things, if we just kind of think, oh, no, that hurts, I don't want to do that, and we walk away from it, then we never ever deal with it. Then we never ever process it and walk with it and walk through it so that we can get to a better place. Our pain calls attention to something in us that needs attention, healing, thoughts, work. If we are hurting and we aren't doing anything about it, we should probably look at that. And, working in the prison, I know a lot of people who, whenever there was any sort of pain or angst in their lives, just did their best to ignore it and pushed it down and pushed it down and pushed it down until suddenly it came up in a way that they could not have imagined. And so are now spending time in Dorchester. The feeling of pain and loss, even the possibility of pain and loss, terrifies us. And sometimes we try to do everything that we can to avoid it. But instead of seeing it as this thing that is just simply trying to create pain or angst for us, instead we see it as a warning. This is something that we should be doing. This is something we should deal with. This is something we should address. Why am I feeling this way? And instead of just thinking, well, I have no choice, look at it and then examine it. But today is actually not about dealing with our own pain. But it's the awareness that our own pain often affects how we deal with other people who are in their pain. Peter is trying to help Jesus. Jesus has come to him and Jesus has said, he asks them who he is. They say, well, you're Elijah, you're this, you're that. And then Peter says, but you're the Messiah. And then Jesus, when this realization of the disciples, he then follows it up and says, and this is what is going to happen to the Messiah. I am going to be rejected. I am going to be abused. I am going to be killed. And he says, on the third day I'll rise again. But Peter's just hearing all of this gloom and doom that Jesus is saying to him. No. And he takes Jesus apart because, come here. Look, don't talk negative. Be positive. Look at the bright side. Everyone's going to love you. I love you. How can everyone else not love you? And you can see that Peter does not want Jesus to be in pain. How many of us, when loved ones come to us and they are suffering or hurting or something hard is going on, we want to take that pain away. We want to tell them, no, don't feel that. It's okay. You'll be fine. Everything will work out. And that's what Peter is doing for Jesus. He's saying, no. Everything's going to be okay. They're not going to reject you. They're going to love you. And Jesus turns on Peter and rebukes him and says, get behind me, Satan. Because in many ways, Peter is offering Jesus the same thing that Satan offered Jesus during the temptation. That here's the easy way. Here, rule them by giving them bread. Jump off the tower so that they can see. Become ruler without having to suffer. Peter is saying to Jesus, look, all of this can happen and you don't have to hurt. But Jesus knows that he does. He knows that his message of love and compassion is going to come into conflict with the powers that be. And that he will be rejected. And that he will be killed. And Peter just doesn't want him to do it. But Jesus isn't looking to Peter to take away his pain. He isn't looking to Peter to make everything right. He is looking to Peter to be with him in his time of hurt. Not to fix it, but just to be present. It's the same thing when they go up to Gethsemane, Peter, James, and John, when Jesus is praying the night of his betrayal and his trial. And he brings those three up with them and he says, stay with me, pray with me. And they all three fall asleep. But he's not asking them to fight the groups that's coming. He's just asking them to be present with him in his pain and in his loss. It's hard. We often try to avoid our own pain and loss, and then when somebody comes up to us, especially people we care deeply for, we want them to avoid their pain and loss. We don't want to see them hurting. And so we try to do everything we can to fix it and make it so they don't have to hurt. When really sometimes what they need is for us simply to stand in the hurt with them, to bear it with them, to walk with them. Pam talks about in the hospital when she's meeting with patients, sometimes when a patient wants to talk about their worries and their fears, when they're dealing with their diagnosis, they can't do it when their family's there. Because as soon as they start saying, I'm really worried, the diagnosis is not good, families, no, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. You're going to kick cancer right out the window. You're going to be able to do this. You're fine. Don't worry. No, everything's good. And the patient will say, well, yes, no, you're right. You're right. Because the family doesn't want them to say, oh no, I'm worried and I'm scared. Because they don't want to be worried and scared. They don't want their loved one to be. So it's easier just to pretend that everything is going to be okay. And the patient isn't able to say what's really eating them up. Isn't able to process or work through the sense of, I think I'm going to die, and that scares me. Because they have to pretend that everything is going to be okay, because now they're doing it for their family, just like their family's doing it for them, and everyone's smiling and waving balloons and pretending everything's going to be great, except it's not, and no one's dealing with it, and that does not make it better. So Pam says she often, she has to catch the person when the family isn't there so that the person can be vulnerable, because they don't want their family to stress for them either. We must be strong for others, we think, and carry it and pretend it doesn't exist. And this is... A friend of mine was talking recently, and her husband was dying. He had a transplant, and a heart... was it a heart transplant? I think so. And then he got cancer. And when you have a transplant, you take drugs to lower your immune system. And so when your immune system is down and then you get cancer, they can't give you drugs to boost your immune system because then it'll reject the transplanted organ. He was dying. And his cancer doctor told him in those last few weeks of his life, when he was in so much pain, that he shouldn't take too much morphine because he didn't want to be addicted when he got there. And my colleague was so mad because she would see her husband in pain and she'd say, take another dose. And he'd say, no, I don't want to get addicted, because the cancer doctor told him everything was going to be fine, that he was going to sail through this. And so those last few weeks was with a lot of pain and anguish. We want to avoid the hurt in our lives. I'm not saying every time you go to a person in the hospital, you sit down and you lay out the worst case scenario and you're all gloom and doom. No, I'm not saying that. But I am saying that you meet the people where they are at. And not just in the hospital, but in our lives. When we're worried, when we're scared. Jesus wants Peter to be there. To be with him in the pain and to hold him. Not physically, but to hold him in such a way that he knows he is not standing there alone. Even Jesus needs to be walked with when he is scared. I used to always wish that I had a different job. When I'd go into the hospital and I would meet with people, I felt helpless because people would tell me what was wrong, and I wished I was a doctor so I could fix it. And now when I work in the prison and people come into the chapel and they talk about, this happened and this happened, I wish I was a lawyer so I could fight for them and make it right. I'm always wishing I had some useful job instead of a chaplain and a minister. Something that made a difference in this world. The passage from James where it says, not all of us are called to be teachers. There have been times when I'm thinking, yeah, because most of you are given useful things to do. But But over the years, I have, slower than I should have, but I have come to realize that I'm not called to fix it. I'm just called to be present, to stand with the people where they are at. And this is something that is not only true for me, but true for all of us. That when our friends, when our families, even when strangers are in pain and are lost, we most of the times can't change it. Sometimes we can, and hallelujah. You know, if we can fix it, let us do it. But most of the time we can't. And so instead of ignoring it or pretending it doesn't exist, then we're called to do the hard task of standing with the people in their pain and in their loss. I had a guy who showed up to my office on Friday, and he was struggling because he had always been someone that others had looked to fix things and to make things work. And then he kind of saw that as his persona. I'm the guy who makes things better. And he says since he's gotten into prison, some of the stupid things that people get mad about, like someone said, well, he mopped up to here, but he was supposed to mop up to here, and I'm not going to mop up to here. And he says, like, they're arguing and yelling at each other about like a square foot of mopping yard. And he says, like, I don't know what to do. And he was struggling because he didn't know how to fix some of these things because they are beyond fixing. And we talked about it, and just the whole idea of, even when you see that people are doing some of the most idiotic things, we aren't called always to fix the problems of others, but we are called to have empathy, to feel their pain, to understand that they are going through a hard time, and to not reject them simply because we don't want to bother. We aren't fixers. We are simply called to be, well, that's not true. Sometimes we can fix things, and that is great. But for a large part of the time, we're simply called to be present with others in their pain and their loss. It's not about the ends. It's not about doing something that'll make it right in the end. It's about being present and doing what's important right now. The ends don't justify the means, but the means are important, and the means for us are to be true to who we are called to be. Compassionate, caring, loving, understanding. And then meet people where they are at. I saw a post recently, a minister during the Vietnam War, every evening was in Washington, D.C., went to the White House and lit a candle as a sign of peace for the White House to see. And his friends came up to him and they said, he says, you have to know that lighting this candle night after night and standing here in front of the White House is not going to change this country or change this war. And the minister looked at him and he says, no, I don't light this candle to change them. I light this candle so they won't change me. That I will remember the importance of peace. I may paraphrase that in the end, but we are called to be faithful to who God has called us to be. And that often means being able to be with people in their pain and accepting the fact that we can't take it away, but we can help carry. We can walk with one another. It's why church community is so important. It's not that we make things, that we fix things, or we always make everything right, or we don't make mistakes. We make lots of mistakes. But we walk together in our joy and in our celebrations, but just as much we walk together in our pain, our loss, and our sorrow. And we know that at the darkest times, we do not walk alone. Trent was outgoing. Trent was one of those guys that you either loved Trent or hated Trent. And it was kind of usually 50-50, but Trent had this large personality. He was always connecting and the life of the party. He'd go into the room, and within 30 seconds, he was the center of everything that was going on. And he some people would call him a little superficial, but he wasn't. He was just filled with energy and ideas and was always trying to change the world. And he had two really good friends. He had Will, who was kind of the exact opposite. Will could be in the room and no one would notice him for like 2 hours. And then they'd say, "Oh, how long have you been here?" Will would say the whole evening. And Caleb. And Caleb was kind of that happy middle ground and was just the sort of solid friend that everyone wanted. And Trent, who had all these ideas of changing the world, of getting rich, of making it, came up with all of these ideas, and some of the ideas were not legal. And so, to the surprise of some, but not many, sorry. One of Trent's ideas landed him in prison. And when he got into prison, he was amazed at how many of his friends that he had, family members, cut off all connection with him. They wanted nothing to do with him. He was now a criminal. He was convicted of fraud. He could not be trusted. And when he reached out, the majority of his friends did not respond, except Will and Caleb. And Caleb most of all. Will would sometimes be hard to get a hold of, but Caleb. Every single time Trent called Caleb, when Trent had to make the call because he was in prison, every single time Caleb picked up. Even when he was at supper with his family, or at one time he got up out of a movie theater so he never ever did not answer when Trent called him. And he would spend as long as Trent needed because he knew that Trent had nothing else right now. That he was in prison, that he was at his lowest moment. And so Caleb took all the time he could to be present with Trent. And when Trent got out, he could not say in words how grateful he was for the friendship, for Will, but especially for Caleb. And he told Caleb, when he makes it rich now the legal way, he was going to share his riches with Caleb, and he'd buy 2 mansions, and they'd buy a little house for Will down at the bottom, and everything was going to be great, and he had all these dreams, and everything was fantastic, and it was hard to keep Trent down because he had this constant optimistic view that the world was always going to be the way it was supposed to be, even in the face of when it wasn't. And because of that attitude, he did not know what to do when Caleb told him that he had cancer. Because that's not how the world works. People don't get cancer, at least not people that he knows, and especially Caleb, who, if there was anyone who did not deserve to get cancer, it would be Caleb. And so right away Trent said, "Ha! Cancer. You're going to whip cancer. It's not going to take you down." And he was all positive, and he was saying, "We'll get this doctor, and we'll get this treatment, and we'll get this." And he was refusing to let Caleb even imagine for a second that it would not work out. But it wasn't working out. And as Caleb got sicker, Trent came around less and less. Because Trent didn't know what to do with Caleb being sick. And when Will called him and said, "Look, we need to help out around the house and stuff," and right away Trent says, "I'll cut his grass." Will said, "Great." So the one day Trent comes and he cuts Caleb's grass, and Caleb comes to the door and he sees that Caleb can barely stand. And Caleb says, "Trent, come on in. We'll have a cup of tea." And Trent sees Caleb there, all sick and shaking, and he's terrified. And he says, "I'd love to, but I got a hot business deal going on, and I'll come back." And he left. And after that, he would make sure that he knew that Caleb was not at home, was at a doctor's appointment or something. And then he would come and cut his grass. And as Caleb got sicker and sicker, Trent became more and more invisible. And then there was that brief period of time when it was kind of that turnaround, when Caleb started to get better, it seemed, and everything was working out. And suddenly Trent was back. As Caleb was getting stronger, Trent came, and everything is working, and it's in remissions, and Trent was saying, "See, I knew this all along. Well, you were worried about nothing. You should have just listened to me." And then it came back. And when it came back this time, Trent again disappeared just as fast. till eventually Will called him up and told him that Caleb had died. Of course, Trent went to the funeral. It wasn't that he wasn't going to go to the funeral. He was going to try to be there supportive for Caleb's family. But he hung back. And he watched Will and his family surround Caleb's wife and their kids, and they were talking and connecting and stuff. And finally, Trent got it within himself, and he walked up to Caleb's wife and he said, "I am so sorry." And then he just broke down because he realized that he had missed all of those chances to talk with Caleb. All of those times he had never showed up because he didn't want to feel the pain. And he was just all this regret that he hadn't had the strength and the courage to be there with Caleb when he knew Caleb needed him. And he just wept. Caleb's wife looked at him and said, "He was never mad at you. He always said to me, this isn't Trent's strong suit." And he never held it against you that you couldn't be there in his time of loss and pain. Never once did he let me say anything bad about you. He was never angry. And if you're worried about that, you don't have to be. He loved you to the end. And then she looked at him. She said, "But I don't. Because I saw him in pain and suffering, and I saw that his best friend had no time for him. So whereas Caleb forgave you, and Caleb never held anything against you, I do not forgive you. And I hold everything against you." It would be perfect, maybe, if we never had to deal with pain and loss and suffering. But we do. It's part of our human life. And we would like to imagine the best for ourselves and for our loved ones, but that is not always the way the life works out. And so we remember and we cherish what we have in this moment, but we also prepare and walk with ourselves and with others in the hard times. We are people that might not fix the world, but we will not abandon the world. We will walk with each other in the high mountain tops and the glorious sun, but we will also walk in those dark valleys and the deepest nights, because that is who we have been called to be. Not those who make the world better, but those who walk with the world in its pain.